Welcome. I trust you are ready for a new mystery to unfold.
The Portrait with the Blue Iris. A Hercule Poirot mystery. Hello and welcome to Cozy Mysteries. I'm Stephen, and tonight I bring you a tale of deception painted in shades of murder. Our story begins on a fog-laden morning in London, where the keen eyes of Belgium's greatest detective would soon examine brushstrokes that concealed more than artistic technique. Chapter 1. The Canvas of Death. The telephone's shrill cry pierced the comfortable silence of Poirot's sitting room at precisely 9:30. The little Belgian detective, immaculate as always in his morning attire, set down his cup of tisane with characteristic precision before answering. Hercule Poirot speaking. Monsieur Poirot, this is Inspector Japp. I'm afraid we have rather an unusual situation on our hands. A murder at the Whitmore Gallery in Bloomsbury. The victim is one Marcus Whitmore, the gallery owner and a respected art restorer. But that's not the peculiar bit. He was found dead in his restoration room, and there's a painting involved that's got everyone in quite a state. Poirot's green eyes flickered with interest. Indeed? And what is so remarkable about this painting, mon ami? Well, that's just it. The experts are claiming it might be a lost Vermeer, worth millions. Whitmore was supposed to unveil it today after months of authentication work. Instead, we found him sprawled beside his easel with a palette knife buried between his shoulder blades. Ah, how theatrical. The artist struck down beside his masterpiece. Tell me, Inspector, who discovered the body? His assistant, Miss Catherine Sterling. Poor girl's in quite a state. She arrived this morning to prepare for the unveiling ceremony, and found him there. The strange thing is, only 5 people have seen this painting since Whitmore acquired it 3 months ago, all very secretive apparently. Poirot stroked his moustache thoughtfully. And these 5 people they are. Miss Sterling, naturally. Then there's Dr. Edmund Harwick, the art authentication expert who was working with Whitmore. Lady Pemberton, a wealthy collector who was considering purchasing the piece. Sir Reginald Thornby representing the National Gallery's interests. And finally, Professor Vincent Ashworth from the Royal Academy. Quite a distinguished group, wouldn't you say? Indeed, and you suspect one of these 5. Well, they're the only ones who knew about the painting's existence and its potential value. The gallery was kept under tight security. Whitmore was paranoid about leaks before the official unveiling. Poirot was already reaching for his hat and coat. I shall be with you directly, Inspector. This case it promises to be most illuminating. 20 minutes later, Poirot stood before the Whitmore Gallery, an elegant Georgian building that housed one of London's most respected private collections. The morning fog clung to the windows like ghostly fingers, and a small crowd of curious onlookers had gathered despite the early hour. Inspector Japp met him at the entrance, his weathered face grave. The body's upstairs in the restoration room. Fair warning, Poirot, it's not a pretty sight. They climbed the narrow staircase to the 2nd floor, past walls lined with carefully curated paintings. The restoration room occupied the rear of the building, its north-facing windows designed to provide optimal natural light for delicate work. Marcus Whitmore lay crumpled beside a large easel, his grey hair matted with blood. The palette knife protruded from his back at an angle that suggested the attack had come from behind. Scattered around the body were tubes of paint, brushes and various restoration tools. But Poirot's attention was immediately drawn to the easel itself. Upon it rested a canvas approximately 18 by 16 inches, depicting a young woman in profile against a dark background. She wore a blue dress with an intricate iris pattern, and her expression held that mysterious quality that seemed to characterize the Dutch master's work. Magnificent, Poirot murmured, stepping closer. If this is indeed a Vermeer, it would be worth several £1,000,000. None? That's what the experts say. Dr. Harwick was particularly excited about it. Claimed it could be Girl with Blue Irises, a painting that was lost during the war. Poirot studied the canvas intently, his trained eye noting the luminous quality of the paint, the masterful use of light that seemed to emanate from within the figure itself. Yet something troubled him, though he could not immediately identify what. The security arrangements, Inspector. Tell me about them. Whitmore had the latest alarm system installed. Only he and Miss Sterling had the codes. The building was locked up tight when she arrived this morning. No signs of forced entry anywhere. So our killer either had a key or was admitted by Whitmore himself. Exactly. And given the timing the day before the unveiling, it seems someone desperately wanted to prevent this painting from being revealed to the world. Poirot knelt beside the body, careful not to disturb the scene. His sharp eyes noted the position of Whitmore's hands, the absence of defensive wounds and the precise angle of the weapon. This was not a crime of passion but one of calculated coldness. Mon Dieu, he whispered, what secrets do you hold, little painting? What truth was worth killing to conceal? As the photographer arrived to document the scene, Poirot continued his careful examination, already sensing that this case would prove to be as layered and complex as the masterpiece that watched over it with painted eyes that seemed to hold secrets of their own. Chapter 2: The Palette of Suspicion. Inspector Japp's notebook rustled as he flipped through the pages, the sound echoing in the quiet restoration room. Poirot stood with his hands clasped behind his back, studying not just the painting but the entire workspace with the methodical precision that had made him London's most sought-after consulting detective. Let us examine what we know, Poirot said, his eyes still fixed on the canvas. Mr. Whitmore, he was a man of routine, yes. According to Miss Sterling, absolutely. Arrived each morning at 8 sharp, worked until 6, rarely deviated from his schedule. She says he was particularly excited about today's unveiling, had been preparing for weeks, and yet someone chose last night to silence him forever. Poirot moved closer to the easel, his keen gaze noting details that others might overlook. Tell me, Inspector, has anyone examined this painting closely since the discovery of the body? Dr. Harwick arrived about an hour ago. He's the authentication expert who was working with Whitmore, seemed quite shaken by the whole affair. He's downstairs with the others if you'd like to speak with him. In a moment. First I must understand what I am seeing. Poirot produced a small magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket and began examining the painting's surface. Curious, very curious indeed. What is it? The brushwork, it is extraordinary. The use of ultramarine blue in the dress, such expensive pigment. But here in this corner, he paused, adjusting his position to catch the light differently. Inspector, would you be so kind as to fetch Dr. Harwick? I believe his expertise is required immediately. While Japp went to summon the expert, Poirot continued his examination. He noted the quality of the canvas, the way the paint had been applied, and most intriguingly, a small area in the lower right corner, where the brushstrokes seemed different, newer somehow. Dr. Edmund Harwick proved to be a tall, scholarly man in his early 60s, with wire-rimmed spectacles and the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors studying art. His hands trembled slightly as he entered the restoration room. Terrible business, simply terrible, he muttered, avoiding looking at the covered body. Marcus was so excited about the painting, he'd spent months analyzing it, running tests. We were both convinced of its authenticity. Dr. Harwick, Poirot said gently, would you be so kind as to tell me about your authentication process? What convinced you this was genuine? Everything really. The canvas dates to the correct period, we had it carbon tested. The pigments are consistent with Vermeer's known palette. The technique, the subject matter, even the way the light falls across the figure's face, it's unmistakably his style. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. And this painting, Girl with Blue Irises, it has a provenance. Harwick's expression grew uncomfortable. That's where things become complicated. The painting's history is somewhat murky. It disappeared from a private collection in Amsterdam during the war. Many such works went missing during that chaotic time. Whitmore acquired it through a dealer in Paris. But the paperwork was, shall we say, less than complete. Ah, I see. And the other members of your little circle, they were equally convinced of its authenticity. Well, that's the thing. Not everyone was in agreement. Harwick glanced nervously toward the stairway. Professor Ashworth from the Royal Academy had his doubts. He felt the brushwork in certain areas was inconsistent, and Sir Reginald from the National Gallery was concerned about the provenance issues. Poirot's eyebrows rose. Indeed, and Lady Pemberton, she was quite eager to purchase it actually, seemed less concerned with the authentication details and more focused on acquiring what could be a masterpiece for her collection. How fascinating. 5 experts, 5 different perspectives. Poirot returned to his examination of the painting. Dr. Harwick, would you say this blue pigment in the iris pattern is particularly unusual? The expert leaned closer, squinting through his glasses. The ultramarine, it's certainly high quality. Lapis lazuli was extremely expensive in Vermeer's time, which is why he used it so sparingly. But here, he paused, frowning. That's odd. This shade seems almost too pure, too vibrant. Precisely my thought. And this area here, in the corner, do you notice anything unusual about the brushwork? Harwick studied the spot Poirot indicated. His face grew pale. Good God, these strokes, they're different, fresher, somehow, as if they were applied much more recently than the rest of the painting. Recent enough perhaps to suggest that someone had been working on this canvas quite recently, making alterations, additions or perhaps corrections. The implications hung in the air like incense in a chapel. If the painting had been altered recently, it raised fundamental questions about its authenticity and provided a compelling motive for murder. I need to run more tests, Harwick said shakily. Spectrographic analysis, X-rays to see what might be underneath. If this painting has been tampered with, then someone killed Marcus Whitmore to prevent him from exposing the deception, Poirot concluded softly, or perhaps to prevent him from completing it. As they spoke, the sound of voices drifted up from the gallery below. The other members of the exclusive circle had arrived, presumably to pay their respects or perhaps to ensure their interests were protected. Each would have their own version of events, their own explanation for why they had gathered to witness the unveiling of what might prove to be either a masterpiece or the most elaborate forgery London had seen in decades. Poirot straightened his tie and checked his pocket watch. The time had come to meet the players in this deadly game of artistic deception, where brushstrokes could conceal as much truth as they revealed, and where the line between genuine and counterfeit extended far beyond the realm of paint and canvas. Chapter 3, The Gathered Mourners. The main gallery below buzzed with hushed conversations as Poirot descended the elegant staircase. 3 figures stood among the carefully arranged artwork, their body language revealing as much about their characters as any formal introduction might. Inspector Japp made the necessary presentations with the efficiency of a man who had grown accustomed to Poirot's unconventional methods. Monsieur Poirot, may I present Lady Eleanor Pemberton? The woman who stepped forward was perhaps 55, impeccably dressed in black silk that spoke of both mourning and expensive taste. Her silver hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and her sharp blue eyes assessed Poirot with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating both people and valuable objects. Monsieur Poirot, your reputation precedes you, she said, extending a gloved hand. Though I must say, these are tragic circumstances under which to make your acquaintance. Marcus was a dear friend and a brilliant man. Indeed, madame, you knew Mr. Whitmore well, for nearly 20 years. I've purchased several pieces through his gallery, and he'd restored works in my collection. When he contacted me about the Vermeer, I was naturally intrigued. Poirot noted the slight emphasis she placed on the word Vermeer, as though she too had doubts about its authenticity. Sir Reginald Thornby, Japp continued, indicating a distinguished gentleman with a carefully groomed white moustache. At 60-odd years, he carried himself with the authority of someone who had spent decades making decisions about which artworks deserved places in Britain's most prestigious galleries. Monsieur Poirot, Sir Reginald's handshake was firm but brief. I represent the National Gallery's interests in this matter. We were cautiously interested in the piece, though I must emphasize the word cautiously. You had reservations about its authenticity, not about its quality. The painting is undeniably beautiful, but provenance is everything in our field. A work without proper documentation is like a man without a birth certificate. It may be legitimate, but proving it becomes problematic. The third figure hung back slightly, a woman in her early 30s with auburn hair and intelligent green eyes red from weeping. Her black dress was simpler than Lady Pemberton's, and her hands showed the slight stains that came from working closely with paints and solvents. Miss Catherine Sterling, Jap said gently, Mr. Whitmore's assistant. I'm so sorry for your loss, mademoiselle, Poirot said with genuine warmth. This must be a terrible shock. Marcus was like a father to me, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I've worked with him for 5 years. He taught me everything about restoration, about seeing beyond the surface of a painting to understand its true nature. And the painting upstairs, you worked on it together. A shadow crossed her face. Not exactly. Marcus became very secretive about it over the past few weeks. He'd work on it alone, always locking it away when I was present. I thought it was just his usual caution, but now you suspect something more. Before she could answer, Professor Vincent Ashworth arrived, apologizing profusely for his lateness. He was a compact man in his 40s, with prematurely grey hair and the ink-stained fingers of an academic. His tweed jacket looked as though he'd slept in it. Terrible news, absolutely terrible, he said, slightly out of breath. The traffic was ghastly, and I couldn't find a cab. How is everyone bearing up? Poirot studied the professor with interest. Unlike the others, who seemed genuinely affected by Whitmore's death, Ashworth appeared more flustered by his tardiness than by the tragedy itself. Professor, you had some doubts about the painting's authenticity, I understand. Ashworth's cheeks reddened slightly. Well, yes, I must admit I did. The technique was magnificent, don't misunderstand me. But there were inconsistencies, subtle ones mind you, the kind that might escape notice unless you'd spent years studying Vermeer's authentic works. What sort of inconsistencies? The brushwork varied in certain areas. Some sections seemed painted with a confidence that suggested intimate familiarity with Vermeer's style, while others felt more studied, as if someone had analyzed his technique but hadn't quite internalized it. Lady Pemberton's expression tightened. Vincent, you never mentioned these concerns to me directly. Well, no, Marcus asked us all to keep our observations confidential until the official authentication was complete. I didn't want to prejudice anyone's opinion. Sir Reginald cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps we should discuss the practical matters at hand. The unveiling ceremony was scheduled for this afternoon. Obviously, that's impossible now, but we need to decide what happens to the painting. It should remain sealed until we can complete proper tests, Doctor. Harwick interjected, having rejoined the group. Given what Monsieur Poirot and I discovered upstairs, I believe further analysis is essential. What did you discover? Miss Sterling asked, her voice sharp with concern. Poirot exchanged a glance with the doctor. Evidence suggests that someone had been working on the painting quite recently, making alterations or additions. The revelation struck the group like a physical blow. Lady Pemberton took a step backward, her face pale. Sir Reginald frowned deeply, while Professor Ashworth seemed almost relieved, as though his suspicions had been confirmed. But it was Miss Sterling's reaction that caught Poirot's attention most keenly. For just a moment before grief and shock reasserted themselves, he glimpsed something else in her eyes, something that looked remarkably like fear. The question now, Poirot said quietly, is whether Mr. Whitmore was killed to prevent him from exposing a forgery, or from completing one. The distinction, subtle though it was, would prove to be the key that unlocked not just the mystery of the painting, but the deadly secret that had cost Marcus Whitmore his life. Chapter 4. The Brushstrokes of Truth. The afternoon light filtering through the gallery's tall windows cast long shadows as Poirot conducted his individual interviews. He had arranged to speak with each member of the group privately, understanding that truth often emerged more readily in intimate conversation than in the charged atmosphere of group discussion. Lady Pemberton was first, settling gracefully into the chair opposite Poirot in the gallery's small office. She had removed her gloves, and he noticed her hands elegant but strong, with the faint discoloration that sometimes came from handling old artwork. Lady Pemberton, you have been collecting art for many years. Since my husband's death 15 years ago, Edward left me well provided for, and I found that surrounding myself with beautiful things helped with the loneliness. Her voice carried a wistful quality that seemed genuine. And this painting, when did Mr. Whitmore first contact you about it? 3 months ago. He was quite excited, said he'd acquired something special. Marcus wasn't given to hyperbole, so when he suggested I might want to see it before he offered it to the National Gallery, I was intrigued. But when you saw it you had reservations. Lady Pemberton hesitated, choosing her words carefully. It was beautiful, undeniably so, but something about it felt, I suppose the word would be eager, as though it was trying too hard to be what it claimed to be. Poirot's eyebrows rose. A most perceptive observation. Did you share these concerns with Mr. Whitmore? I did actually, but he assured me that authentication would resolve any doubts. He seemed confident, even defensive about the piece. Defensive? In what way? When I mentioned that certain areas of the brushwork seemed different from other Vermeers I'd seen, he became quite sharp, said that each painter's work evolved over time, and that this might represent a different period in Vermeer's development. After Lady Pemberton departed, Poirot spent a few minutes making notes before calling for Professor Ashworth. The academic entered with the nervous energy of someone who spent more time with books than people. Professor, your reputation as a Vermeer scholar is well established. What specifically troubled you about this painting? Ashworth settled into his chair and immediately began fidgeting with his pen. It's difficult to explain to a layman. Imagine studying someone's handwriting for years, learning to recognize every quirk and characteristic. Then you encounter a letter that seems to be in their hand, but something feels wrong. And what felt wrong here? The ultramarine blue for one thing. Vermeer was notoriously careful with expensive pigments. He used ultramarine sparingly, usually reserving it for the most important elements. But in this painting, it appears almost lavishly in the iris pattern of the dress. Could this not simply represent a commission from a wealthy patron who could afford such luxury? Perhaps, but there were other issues. The underpainting, from what I could glimpse through microscopic examination, showed techniques that weren't fully developed until later periods. And the canvas, he paused, looking uncomfortable. Yes, the canvas appeared authentic to the period, but there were areas where the paint seemed to sit differently, as though the surface had been prepared multiple times. Poirot leaned forward with interest. Multiple times. It's a technique sometimes used by forgers. They take a genuine old canvas, perhaps one with a damaged or inferior painting, strip it clean, and paint their forgery over it. The aged canvas gives authenticity, but the painting itself is modern. When Sir Reginald took his turn, he presented a more diplomatic perspective, though no less illuminating. The National Gallery's interest was primarily academic, he explained. If authentic, this would have been a significant addition to our understanding of Vermeer's work. But we required absolute certainty before making any commitment, and Mr. Whitmore understood this. Initially, yes, but over the past few weeks, he seemed increasingly anxious for us to make a decision. He mentioned other interested parties, suggested that if we delayed too long, the opportunity might pass us by. Other parties besides Lady Pemberton. He never named them specifically, but he implied there were private collectors in America who were prepared to make substantial offers. Finally, it was Miss Sterling's turn. She entered the office with obvious reluctance, her eyes still red from weeping, but now carrying a wariness that hadn't been there earlier. Miss Sterling, you worked closely with Mr. Whitmore. Did his behavior change in recent weeks? Yes, she admitted quietly. He became secretive, almost paranoid. He installed additional locks on the restoration room and changed the alarm codes without telling me the new ones. That must have been hurtful, given your close working relationship. Tears welled in her eyes. I thought he no longer trusted me. I couldn't understand what I'd done wrong.
But now, perhaps, you suspect it wasn't about trust but about protection? She nodded slowly. Marcus discovered something about the painting, didn't he? Something that put him in danger. What makes you think so? 2 nights ago, I stayed late to finish cataloguing some new acquisitions. I heard voices from the restoration room. Marcus was arguing with someone. I couldn't make out the words, but he sounded angry, almost frightened. Did you see who it was? No, I was afraid to interrupt. But when I arrived the next morning, Marcus seemed haggard, as though he hadn't slept, and he spent the entire day locked in the restoration room with the painting. As the afternoon waned, Poirot gathered his observations like an artist mixing colours on a palette. Each interview had added another shade to his understanding of the case, and a picture was beginning to emerge, one that suggested the painting's secret was far more complex than a simple question of authenticity. The truth, like the masterpiece upstairs, had layers, and Poirot suspected that peeling them back would reveal not just the mystery of the painting's origin, but the deadly secret that had made murder the only solution in someone's desperate mind. Chapter 5. The Hidden Canvas. The following morning brought Dr. Harwick rushing to the gallery with results from his overnight analysis of the painting. Poirot found him in the restoration room, bent over a series of X-ray images spread across Whitmore's workbench, his face pale with excitement and concern. "Monsieur Poirot, you must see this," Harwick said without preamble, gesturing to the black and white images. "These X-rays reveal something extraordinary beneath the surface of our mysterious painting." Poirot examined the ghostly images with his characteristic intensity. Even to his untrained eye, the X-rays clearly showed two distinct layers of paint, one overlaying the other. "There is another painting underneath?" "Indeed, and that's not all. The underlying work appears to be a genuine period piece. The brushwork, the composition, the use of space, it all suggests authentic 17th century craftsmanship, but not Vermeer. No, almost certainly not. The style appears more consistent with one of his contemporaries, perhaps Peter de Hooch or Gerard Terborch. Still valuable, mind you, but nowhere near the millions that a Vermeer would command." Poirot studied the X-rays more carefully, his mind working through the implications. So someone took a genuine but less valuable painting and painted over it to create a supposed Vermeer. That's certainly how it appears. The forger was quite skilled. They preserved the authentic aged canvas and probably used period-appropriate pigments mixed with modern binding agents to achieve the right visual effect. All except for the ultramarine blue in the iris pattern. Exactly, that appears to be completely modern. High-quality synthetic ultramarine which wasn't available until the 19th century. It was probably added last, perhaps to enhance the Vermeer-like quality of the piece. Inspector Japp, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. "So we're dealing with a forgery, but a bloody sophisticated one." "Indeed," Poirot mused, "but this raises new questions. Was Mr. Whitmore the forger, or did he discover that he had been deceived? And more importantly, who among our suspects possesses the skill and knowledge to execute such a deception?" The answer to at least part of that question came sooner than expected. As they spoke, Miss Sterling appeared at the door of the restoration room, her face flushed from climbing the stairs quickly. "Forgive the interruption," she said breathlessly, "but I've found something I think you should see." In her hands was a leather portfolio, worn with age and handling. This was in Marcus's desk drawer. "I was looking for the insurance papers when I found it." She opened the portfolio to reveal a collection of sketches, notes, and what appeared to be preparatory studies for the painting upstairs. Poirot examined the contents carefully. The sketches showed various iterations of the young woman in the blue dress, with notes in what appeared to be Whitmore's handwriting comparing different approaches to the composition and color palette. "These are preliminary studies?" he asked. "It appears so, but that's what's strange. Marcus never worked this way. He was a restorer, not a painter. He conserved and repaired existing works but never created original pieces." Dr. Harwick leaned over Poirot's shoulder to examine the sketches. "These show remarkable skill. The understanding of light, the attention to period-appropriate details. This level of work requires years of study and practice." Or, Poirot said quietly, collaboration with someone who possessed such skills. He turned to Miss Sterling with renewed interest. "Mademoiselle, your training is in restoration as well." "Yes, though I did study painting before specializing in conservation work, but I could never create anything like this." She gestured toward the sketches with obvious admiration mixed with bewilderment. "Yet someone could. Someone with intimate knowledge of 17th century Dutch painting techniques, access to period-appropriate materials, and the skill to execute such a convincing pastiche." Inspector Japp consulted his notebook. "That narrows our suspect list considerably. Of our 5 witnesses, who has the technical ability to create this forgery?" "Professor Ashworth certainly has the academic knowledge," Dr. Harwick offered reluctantly. "And Lady Pemberton has extensive experience with period artwork, though I'm not sure about her practical skills. Sir Reginald would have access to conservation laboratories and technical resources through the National Gallery," Miss Sterling added. And I, she trailed off, realizing the implication of her words. And you, mademoiselle, have both the technical training and daily access to this studio, Poirot concluded gently but firmly. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Outside, London life continued its bustling pace, unaware that in this quiet room, the threads of a complex deception were slowly being untangled. Poirot returned his attention to the X-ray images, studying them with the intensity of a scholar examining an ancient manuscript. The painting beneath, can we determine anything about its original subject matter? Dr. Harwick adjusted his glasses and pointed to specific areas of the X-ray. It appears to be a domestic scene, possibly a woman reading a letter. Very typical of the period, and actually quite charming in its own right. Then someone destroyed a perfectly good painting to create this forgery. But why take such a risk? Why not simply forge a work on blank canvas? Because, Miss Sterling said slowly, understanding dawning in her voice, the aged canvas and underlying layers would pass any authenticity test. The forgery would be virtually undetectable unless someone specifically looked beneath the surface, which suggests our forger expected this painting to face rigorous authentication, Poirot observed. They wanted it to survive the most sophisticated analysis. The implications were staggering. This wasn't the work of an opportunistic criminal, but of someone with extensive knowledge of both art and the authentication process itself. Someone who understood exactly what tests would be performed and how to pass them. Someone who might have been involved in the authentication process from the very beginning. Chapter 6. The reflection in the mirror. As Poirot continued his examination of the forged painting, in the background of the composition, barely visible in the shadows, was the reflection of a mirror, a common element in Dutch Golden Age paintings, often used to add depth and symbolic meaning to domestic scenes. But this mirror held a secret that would prove crucial to solving the case. Dr. Harwick, would you bring your magnifying equipment here, please? Poirot requested, positioning himself at a specific angle to catch the light across the painting's surface. As the authentication expert adjusted his high-powered magnifier and directed a lamp toward the canvas, the mirror's reflection became clearer. What had initially appeared to be merely atmospheric shadow resolved into something far more specific. Mon Dieu, Poirot breathed. Look carefully at what is reflected in this mirror. Dr. Harwick peered through the magnifier, adjusting the focus carefully. It's a figure, someone watching the scene from outside the frame of the painting. But this is impossible. Vermeer never included such obvious voyeuristic elements in his work. Precisely, and more importantly, examine the clothing, the posture, the distinctive silhouette. As Harwick studied the reflection more intently, his face grew pale. The figure appears to be wearing modern clothing. This coat, the cut of it, it's contemporary, not period appropriate at all. Inspector Japp, who had been making notes, looked up sharply. You mean the forger painted himself into the scene? Not intentionally, I suspect, Poirot replied. This appears to be what we might call an artistic accident. The forger was working from a mirror or reflective surface to check their work, and inadvertently captured their own reflection in the painted mirror. Miss Sterling stepped closer, studying the tiny reflected figure with growing recognition. That silhouette, I know that posture. Marcus always stood exactly like that when he was concentrating on detailed work, with his left shoulder slightly raised. The revelation struck the room like a physical blow. Dr. Harwick stepped back from the magnifier, his face ashen. Are you suggesting that Marcus Whitmore created this forgery himself? It would explain many things, Poirot mused. His secrecy in recent weeks, his defensive attitude about the painting's authenticity, his reluctance to allow others to examine it closely. But why would he do such a thing? Miss Sterling protested. Marcus was respected, successful. He had no need to risk his reputation on forgery. Perhaps he did not see it as forgery, Poirot suggested. Consider this scenario. Mr. Whitmore acquires what he believes to be a damaged Vermeer. The surface painting is badly deteriorated, but the canvas is authentic. In an attempt to restore the work, he removes the damaged paint, only to discover another painting beneath, one that is period appropriate but not by Vermeer. And then, Inspector Japp prompted,
Then, faced with the choice between revealing a relatively modest discovery or creating something magnificent, he chose to paint his own interpretation of what the lost Vermeer might have looked like. In his mind, perhaps, he was not creating a forgery, but completing a restoration of a work that had been destroyed by time and neglect. Dr. Harwick shook his head in dismay. It would explain his confidence in the authentication process. He knew the underlying elements would pass every test because they were genuine. Only the surface painting was his creation. But someone discovered his secret, Poirot continued. Someone who recognized what he had done and perhaps threatened to expose him. The implications were clear and chilling. If Whitmore had created the forgery, then his murder was not about preventing the exposure of someone else's crime, but about silencing the artist himself. Who among our suspects would have the expertise to recognize such a sophisticated deception? Inspector Japp asked. Any of them potentially, Miss Sterling said reluctantly. We all have extensive experience with authentication techniques. Professor Ashworth particularly, he's written papers on forgery detection methods, but recognition is one thing, Poirot observed. The question is, who would have been motivated to kill rather than simply expose the forgery? Dr. Harwick cleared his throat uncomfortably. There's something else we should consider. If Marcus had succeeded in selling this piece as a Vermeer, the buyer would eventually discover the deception. When that happened, everyone involved in the authentication process would face serious professional consequences, including yourself, Doctor, including all of us. Our reputations would be ruined, our careers destroyed. The art world is remarkably unforgiving when it comes to authentication failures, particularly ones involving millions of pounds. The motive picture was becoming clearer, but it also complicated the case significantly. Each member of the authentication group had professional reasons to fear the discovery of the forgery, but also personal reasons that might drive them to murder. Lady Pemberton, who had built her reputation as a discerning collector, would face social humiliation if she had been deceived by a fake. Sir Reginald would potentially lose his position at the National Gallery. Professor Ashworth's academic credibility would be destroyed. Dr. Harwick's authentication business would collapse, and Miss Sterling, as Whitmore's assistant, would be suspected of complicity in the deception. But there's another possibility we must consider, Poirot said, his green eyes flickering with sudden insight. What if Miss Whitmore was not the forger, but had discovered the forgery, and was preparing to expose it? What if someone else created this deception, and killed him to prevent its revelation? The suggestion shifted the entire dynamic of the case once again. If Whitmore had been the victim of deception rather than its perpetrator, then his murder took on a different character entirely. The sketches in his portfolio, Miss Sterling said suddenly, I assumed they were preparatory work for creating the forgery, but what if they were analytical studies? Marcus was meticulous about understanding every aspect of a painting's construction. If he suspected forgery, he would have made detailed studies to prove his theory. Dr. Harwick examined the sketches again with this new perspective. You may be right. These notes, they're not instructions for creation, but observations about technique and anachronisms. Look here, he's noted inconsistencies in the brushwork that would indicate modern creation, which means, Poirot concluded, that Mr. Whitmore had discovered the truth about the painting and was preparing to reveal it at yesterday's unveiling ceremony. Someone killed him to prevent that revelation. The case had turned full circle, but with each revolution, the truth became clearer. The painting was indeed a forgery, sophisticated enough to fool initial examination, but containing subtle clues that would inevitably lead to its exposure. Whitmore had found those clues, and his discovery had cost him his life. But who among the 5 suspects possessed both the skill to create such a deception, and the desperation to kill in order to protect it? As the afternoon shadows lengthened in the restoration room, Poirot found himself studying not just the forged painting, but the faces of those who surrounded it, looking for the reflection of truth in their carefully guarded expressions. Chapter 7. The Artist's True Hand. The revelation that Marcus Whitmore might have been the forgery's discoverer rather than its creator sent ripples of possibility through the investigation. Poirot spent the evening in his lodgings, surrounded by his notes, photographs of the painting, and the sketches from Whitmore's portfolio, constructing and deconstructing theories with the methodical precision of a master craftsman. The next morning brought unexpected visitors to the gallery. Poirot arrived to find Inspector Japp in heated discussion with an elegantly dressed woman in her 40s, accompanied by a nervous-looking gentleman in an expensive but rumpled suit. "Ah, Poirot," Japp called out with obvious relief. "Perfect timing. Allow me to introduce Mrs. Helena Dubois and Mr. Charles Brennan, representatives of the Parisian art dealer who originally sold the painting to Mr. Whitmore." Mrs. Dubois extended a perfectly manicured hand, her French accent cultured, but carrying an undertone of anxiety. "Monsieur Poirot, we have come as soon as we heard of poor Marcus's death. Such a tragedy, and for such a dedicated man. You knew Mr. Whitmore well, madame, for many years. He was one of our most trusted clients, very knowledgeable, very careful about provenance and authenticity. When this particular piece came into our possession, we thought immediately of him." Mr. Brennan, who had been fidgeting with his hat, stepped forward. "The thing is, Monsieur Poirot, we're rather concerned about the circumstances. You see, the painting's history is complex." Poirot's eyebrows rose. "Complex? In what way, monsieur?" Mrs. Dubois and Brennan exchanged glances before she continued. "The piece came to us through an estate sale in Amsterdam. The family had owned it for generations, but they needed to liquidate assets for tax purposes. The documentation was authentic. We verified the provenance back to the 18th century. But..." Poirot sensed there was more to the story, but Brennan continued reluctantly. "After we sold it to Whitmore, we received information that suggested the piece might not be what it appeared to be. Another dealer in Amsterdam claimed that the family had sold him the original years earlier, and what we had acquired was a contemporary copy made for insurance purposes. The implications were staggering. If the Parisians had unknowingly sold Whitmore a copy, believing it to be original, then the entire authentication process had been built on false premises." "Did you communicate these concerns to Mr. Whitmore?" Poirot asked. "Charles attempted to reach him several times over the past month," Mrs. Dubois replied. "But Marcus seemed reluctant to discuss the matter. He insisted that his analysis confirmed the painting's authenticity. Or perhaps," Poirot mused, "he had discovered something that you had not, and was preparing to prove it." Inspector Japp consulted his notebook. "This puts a different complexion on things. If Whitmore knew he'd been sold a copy but was claiming it was original, that gives him motive for the forgery. But if he'd discovered it was a copy, and was preparing to expose that fact, then someone else had a powerful motive to silence him," Poirot completed. They were interrupted by the arrival of Professor Ashworth, who appeared agitated and somewhat disheveled. His usually neat appearance was marred by paint stains on his jacket cuffs, and detail that did not escape Poirot's notice. "Professor," Poirot greeted him, "you seem distressed. Is there something troubling you about this case?" Ashworth glanced nervously at the Parisian dealers before responding. "I've been conducting my own analysis of the painting, and I'm afraid I've uncovered some disturbing evidence." He produced a small vial containing what appeared to be paint samples. "I took the liberty of extracting microscopic samples from several areas of the canvas. The binding agents used in the paint are modern, specifically a synthetic resin that wasn't developed until the 1950s. Dr. Harwick, who had just arrived for the day, examined the vial with growing alarm. "Are you certain? That would definitively prove the surface painting is contemporary." "I'm afraid there's no doubt. Whoever created this work used modern materials to achieve a period appearance. The technique is sophisticated, but the chemistry doesn't lie." Mrs. Dubois grew pale. "But this is impossible. The piece we sold to Marcus was already painted when it came into our possession. We never claimed it was recently created." "Which suggests," Poirot said quietly, "that the forgery was created before it reached your gallery. Someone in the chain of ownership, perhaps even generations ago, substituted a copy for the original work." The case was becoming more complex by the hour. If the painting had been a forgery before reaching Whitmore, then his authentication work would have eventually exposed that fact.
His murder might have been committed by someone who needed the painting to remain unexamined, someone who had invested significantly in its supposed authenticity. Lady Pemberton mentioned that she had made a substantial deposit toward purchasing the piece. Inspector Japp recalled, if she discovered she'd been deceived, a woman of her social standing would face considerable humiliation. Poirot agreed. But would she commit murder to avoid it? As they discussed the possibilities, Miss Sterling appeared at the top of the stairs, her face flushed with excitement and concern. Monsieur Poirot, she called down, could you come upstairs immediately? I've found something in Marcus's private papers that changes everything. The group climbed to the restoration room, where Miss Sterling had spread several documents across Whitmore's workbench. Among them was a letter, dated just 3 days before his death, written in his careful handwriting. Read this, she said, pointing to the letter. Poirot read aloud, My dear Catherine, if something should happen to me before I can complete this investigation, you must know the truth about the painting. It is indeed a forgery, but not in the way anyone suspects. The deception runs much deeper than a simple matter of false attribution. The person responsible has access to our authentication process and has been manipulating the results from the beginning. I have evidence, but I fear I may not live to present it. The blue iris holds the key. Examine it carefully, and you will understand. Trust no one until the truth is revealed. The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakably Whitmore's. As its implications sank in, each member of the group looked at the others with new suspicion. Whitmore had known his life was in danger, and he had identified his killer. But his cryptic reference to the blue iris remained a puzzle that would need to be solved before justice could be served. Chapter 8. The Chemical Signature. The reference to the blue iris in Whitmore's letter sent Poirot and Dr. Harwick back to their detailed examination of the painting with renewed intensity. Using high-powered magnification and specialized lighting, they focused on the intricate iris pattern woven through the subject's blue dress. The ultramarine pigment in this area is different from the rest of the painting, Dr. Harwick observed, adjusting his equipment for optimal viewing. It's not just modern, it's been applied over the original paint layer almost like a signature or marking. Poirot studied the pattern carefully. It is deliberate then, not part of the original composition, definitely deliberate. And there's something else, the way the paint has been applied suggests it was done with a very specific brush, one with an unusual texture. As they examined the iris pattern more closely, a startling discovery emerged. Hidden within the decorative swirls of the design were tiny letters, so small as to be nearly invisible to the naked eye, but clearly visible under magnification. There, Poirot pointed. Do you see? Letters worked into the pattern itself. Dr. Harwick adjusted the focus. CAS. It spells something. Let me follow the pattern. CASTERLING. The revelation hit them both simultaneously. Catherine Sterling, Poirot breathed. Miss Sterling's name is hidden in the iris pattern. But before they could fully process this discovery, Inspector Japp's voice echoed from downstairs, tinged with urgency. Poirot, you need to come down here immediately. They hurried to the main gallery, where they found Japp standing over an opened package that had just been delivered by special courier. Inside was another painting, smaller than the supposed Vermeer, but clearly from the same period and style. This was addressed to you personally, Poirot, Japp explained. The courier said it was to be delivered only after confirmation of a death notice in yesterday's papers. The painting depicted a young woman in a blue dress, but this one was clearly authentic. The brushwork, the use of light, the subtle modeling of the figure all spoke to genuine 17th century Dutch mastery. Most remarkably, the woman's dress featured an iris pattern that was nearly identical to the one in the forged painting upstairs. Attached to the frame was a sealed envelope marked to be opened by Hercule Poirot in the event of my death, Marcus Whitmore. With careful precision, Poirot opened the envelope and read the contents aloud to the assembled group. My dear Monsieur Poirot, if you are reading this, then my fears have been realized and someone has killed me to prevent the truth from being revealed. The painting in your possession is the original work that was replaced by the forgery currently hanging in my restoration room. I discovered the substitution 3 weeks ago, when chemical analysis revealed modern binding agents in what should have been a period piece. The forgery is the work of someone with intimate knowledge of both my authentication methods and the painting's history. They used an aged canvas and period-appropriate techniques, but they made one crucial error. They signed their work in the iris pattern of the dress, believing it would never be detected. The forger is someone who had access to my studio, my materials and my research. Someone who knew exactly what tests I would perform, and how to pass them. Most importantly, someone who stood to lose everything if the deception were discovered. I have hidden the original painting because I feared for its safety. The person responsible for the forgery has already made threats against my life, claiming that exposure of the deception would destroy innocent people. But I cannot allow a forgery to be sold as authentic, regardless of the consequences. The truth must be revealed, no matter what the cost. The letter was signed with Whitmore's distinctive flourish, but it left one crucial question unanswered. Who was the forger whose name was hidden in the iris pattern? As if summoned by the revelation, Miss Sterling appeared at the top of the stairs, having obviously been listening to Poirot's reading of the letter. Her face was pale but determined. "You found it," she said quietly, descending slowly. "I was hoping he had hidden it safely." "Miss Sterling," Poirot said gently, "we have discovered your name in the iris pattern of the forged painting. Would you care to explain how it came to be there?" She reached the bottom of the stairs and faced the group with dignity despite her obvious distress. "Because I painted it. I created the forgery that hangs in Marcus's restoration room." The confession sent shockwaves through the assembled group. Dr. Harwick stepped back in astonishment, while Inspector Japp reached instinctively for his handcuffs. "But why?" Poirot asked. "What drove you to such deception?" Miss Sterling's composure finally cracked, and tears began to flow. "Because I needed the money. My mother is dying of cancer, and the treatments, they're experimental, expensive, not covered by insurance. When Marcus acquired what we thought was a damaged Vermeer, I saw an opportunity." "So you created the forgery while Mr. Whitmore worked on authentication of what he believed was the original?" "Yes. I used an aged canvas from our storage room, one that dated to the right period. I thought, if I could create a convincing Vermeer using period-appropriate techniques, I could sell it privately, while Marcus worked on what he thought was the original. But then Mr. Whitmore's analysis revealed that his painting was actually the forgery, and yours was more convincing than you had intended." She nodded miserably. "My work was too good. When his tests revealed modern binding agents in what he thought was the original, he realized that painting was the fake. He started investigating and eventually discovered what I had done, and when he confronted you, he gave me an ultimatum. Either confess to the authorities and return the original painting, or he would expose me himself. He said he understood my desperation, but he couldn't allow fraud to be committed in his name." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but one crucial question remained unanswered. If Miss Sterling had created the forgery, who had killed Marcus Whitmore?
Chapter 9. The Final Deception. The confession had stunned everyone present, but Poirot's sharp eyes noticed something that others had missed. Miss Sterling's account, while emotionally compelling, contained subtle inconsistencies that troubled his methodical mind. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, "your story is touching, and your motives understandable, but I fear you are not telling us the complete truth." She looked up sharply, tears still streaming down her cheeks. "What do you mean? I've confessed to creating the forgery. What more is there to tell? The technical skill required to create such a convincing work, for one thing. Your training, while excellent, is in restoration, not in the creation of original works in period style. The forgery upstairs demonstrates knowledge and ability that would take years to develop." Dr. Harwick nodded in agreement. "Monsieur Poirot is correct. The brushwork, the understanding of light and shadow, the authentic application of period techniques, this is master-level work." Furthermore, Poirot continued, "the signature hidden in the iris pattern is too obvious, too easily discovered once one knows what to look for. It seems almost as though it were placed there deliberately to implicate you." Inspector Japp, who had been listening intently, stepped forward. Are you saying someone else created the forgery and is framing Miss Sterling? I am saying that the truth is more complex than it first appears. Poirot turned to address the entire group. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been witnessing a performance, a carefully orchestrated deception designed to misdirect our investigation. Professor Ashworth, who had been unusually quiet during Miss Sterling's confession, shifted uncomfortably. I don't understand what you're suggesting, Monsieur Poirot. I am suggesting, Professor, that you understand perfectly well. Poirot's green eyes fixed on the academic with laser intensity. The paint stains on your jacket cuffs are not from your analysis work yesterday, as you claimed. They are ultramarine blue, the same expensive pigment used in the iris pattern, and they are fresh applied within the last few days. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Professor Ashworth's face cycled through several emotions: surprise, indignation, and finally a calculating resignation. You can't prove that, he said quietly. Can I not, Doctor? Harrick's chemical analysis will confirm that the synthetic resins in the paint came from your laboratory at the Royal Academy. Your access to period canvases, your expertise in Dutch Golden Age techniques, your knowledge of authentication procedures, you had every tool necessary to create this deception. But what would be his motive? Lady Pemberton asked, clearly shaken by the turn of events. Poirot turned to address her directly. That is where you become crucial to this story, madame. Professor Ashworth has been selling you forgeries for years, hasn't he? Works he claimed were recently discovered pieces by minor masters, priced just below the threshold that would trigger intensive authentication. Lady Pemberton's face went white. That's impossible. Vincent is a respected scholar who needed money desperately, Poirot continued. His academic salary could not support his gambling debts, could it, Professor? So you began supplementing your income by creating newly discovered works for wealthy collectors who trusted your reputation. Professor Ashworth remained silent, but his expression confirmed Poirot's deductions. The plan was elegant, Poirot continued. When Mr. Whitmore acquired what he believed was a damaged Vermeer, you saw an opportunity for the greatest deception of your career. You created a masterful forgery, then arranged for Miss Sterling to be blamed when the authentication process inevitably revealed inconsistencies. How? Inspector Japp demanded. By planting her name in the iris pattern, by ensuring she had access to the materials, by creating circumstances that would make her appear desperate enough to commit such a crime. Meanwhile, you positioned yourself as the skeptical expert, the one voice questioning the painting's authenticity. Who would suspect the man who had doubts from the beginning? Miss Sterling looked up with dawning understanding. He knew about my mother's illness. He offered to help with the medical bills, if I would assist with authentication work. But it wasn't authentication. He was using me as a cover for his forgery operation. And when Mr. Whitmore's investigation got too close to the truth, I didn't mean to kill him, Professor Ashworth said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. I went to reason with him, to explain that exposure would ruin innocent people like Lady Pemberton who had purchased works in good faith. But he was inflexible. He said the truth had to come out regardless of the consequences. So you struck him down with the palette knife. It was impulse, panic. I saw my career, my reputation, my entire life collapsing. When he turned away to show me some evidence he had compiled, I acted without thinking. The confession filled the gallery with heavy silence. Professor Ashworth sat down heavily in one of the viewing chairs, the weight of his crimes finally crushing his scholarly dignity. The irony, Poirot observed sadly, is that your forgery was genuinely magnificent. Under different circumstances, your artistic talent might have brought you legitimate success and recognition. But instead, Inspector Japp concluded grimly, reaching for his handcuffs, Professor Vincent Ashworth, I arrest you for the murder of Marcus Whitmore. As the formalities of arrest proceeded, Poirot found himself studying the genuine painting that Whitmore had hidden, the real work that had started this deadly chain of deception. In its authentic beauty, unmarred by false signatures or desperate schemes. He saw the truth that Marcus Whitmore had died to protect, that art, like justice, was diminished when corrupted by lies, no matter how skillfully crafted those lies might be. Chapter 10. The Portrait Restored. 1 week after Professor Ashworth's arrest, Poirot sat in the quiet elegance of his Baker Street lodgings, putting the finishing touches on his case notes. The autumn light streaming through his windows seemed particularly appropriate as he reflected on a case where appearances had been so thoroughly deceiving. Inspector Japp had stopped by that afternoon to provide the final details of the investigation's conclusion, and now Poirot was preparing to close this particular chapter in his files. The genuine Vermeer, for such it had proven to be after exhaustive authentication, had been returned to its rightful place in art history. The chemical analysis of the original canvas and pigments had confirmed beyond doubt that this was indeed the long-lost girl with blue iris, painted sometime between 1658 and 1660. Its value, both artistic and monetary, was beyond calculation. Lady Pemberton, after recovering from the shock of learning she had been deceived by Professor Ashworth for years, had agreed to purchase the painting for her private collection, though she insisted it would eventually be donated to the National Gallery upon her death. The transaction had provided Miss Sterling's mother with access to the experimental treatments she needed, a silver lining to the dark cloud that had engulfed so many lives. Professor Ashworth faced charges not only for murder, but for an elaborate forgery scheme that had stretched back nearly a decade. The investigation had uncovered at least 15 fake paintings in various collections, each bearing his secret signatures hidden in decorative elements where only the most careful examination would reveal them. His scholarly reputation had provided the perfect cover for his criminal activities, allowing him to operate with impunity among collectors who trusted his expertise implicitly. Dr. Harwick had been cleared of any wrongdoing, his authentication work having been exemplary throughout. The chemical analysis that had first detected modern binding agents in what appeared to be the authentic painting had been correct. He had simply been examining the forgery while the genuine work remained hidden. Sir Reginald Thornby had emerged from the scandal with his reputation intact, having demonstrated the National Gallery's commitment to rigorous authentication procedures. The institution's caution regarding the painting's provenance had proven wise, even if their suspicions had not identified the correct source of the problem. Miss Sterling, though traumatized by her unwitting involvement in the scheme, had been formally cleared of any criminal charges. Her cooperation with the investigation, combined with evidence of Ashworth's manipulation and coercion, had convinced the Crown prosecutor that she had been a victim rather than a conspirator. She had returned to work at the gallery, now under the ownership of a trust established by Lady Pemberton to continue Marcus Whitmore's legacy. As Poirot reviewed his notes one final time, he reflected on the layers of deception that had made this case so challenging. Like the painting itself, the truth had existed beneath multiple layers of misdirection, each apparently authentic but concealing the reality underneath. The telephone's ring interrupted his contemplation. Inspector Japp's familiar voice carried a note of satisfaction as he provided the final update. "Thought you'd want to know, Poirot. Professor Ashworth has agreed to cooperate fully with our investigation into his forgery network. He's providing information about buyers, other forgers and the entire operation. Looks like we'll be able to recover most of the fake pieces and compensate the victims. And his motive for the murder, has he provided a complete account?" "He has. Just as you deduced, Whitmore's investigation was closing in on the truth, and Ashworth panicked. He'd spent years building his double life, and the thought of exposure drove him to desperate measures. He genuinely seems remorseful about Whitmore's death, claims it was never part of his plan. Perhaps not, but murder is rarely planned by those who commit it in the heat of the moment. The capacity for violence often surprises even those who possess it." After ending the call, Poirot returned to his final case notes. In his neat handwriting, he recorded his conclusion: "The case of the portrait, with the blue irises, serves as a reminder that deception in art mirrors deception in life. Both may appear masterful on the surface, while concealing fundamental flaws underneath." Professor Ashworth possessed genuine talent and knowledge, but his moral weakness corrupted both, leading ultimately to the destruction of everything he claimed to value. Marcus Whitmore died because he refused to compromise with falsehood, even when that refusal cost him his life. His integrity, like the authentic Vermeer he died protecting, possessed a luminous quality that no amount of skilled imitation could replicate. In the end, as in all cases involving deception, the truth revealed itself through careful examination of details others had overlooked. The reflection in the painted mirror, the chemical composition of pigments, the hidden signature in the iris pattern, each clue properly interpreted, contributed to the complete picture of what had occurred. Art, like justice, demands authenticity. Both are diminished when corrupted by those who would use skilled technique in service of deception rather than truth. As evening settled over London, Poirot closed his case file and placed it carefully in his filing cabinet, alongside the records of his other investigations. Somewhere in the city, a genuine masterpiece hung in its new home, its beauty unmarred by the violence that had been committed in its name. The portrait with the blue iris had survived centuries of history, war, and human folly to emerge finally into the light where it belonged. And in the quiet satisfaction of justice served and truth revealed, Hercule Poirot found the same luminous quality that had made the painting worth killing for, the irreplaceable value of authenticity, in a world too often satisfied with skilled imitations of the real thing. The case was closed, but the painting would endure, its beauty serving as a testament to the enduring power of truth over deception, and the ultimate triumph of those who refuse to compromise with falsehood, no matter what the cost. Thank you for joining us for another cozy mystery. I'm Stephen, and I hope you've enjoyed this tale of art, deception, and the brilliant deductive mind of Hercule Poirot. Until next time, remember that truth, like great art, has a quality that no amount of skillful imitation can replicate.